to have as many questions as possible so that we can really work with the team. Just to let you know that this session is our 265th session with public bodies. So we have had so far since we started our operation about 264. So we'll get straight into the presentation unless there are any questions before we start.
None. You can go straight into the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And again, this has to deal with the public procurement and disposal of public property. Many a times we hear, and just to improve on equality, I will just go off camera until we are ready to take back the question, because we get a better bandwidth at our end here. Great, so thank you very much again. So we go straight into our presentation. And by virtue of the agenda, we'll be looking at public procurement and the impact of corruption in public bodies, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, the amendments to the Act that would have taken place over 2016, 2017, and 2020, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Regulations, and where are we in terms of full proclamation. And at the back end of it, you'll see the references. We will be sharing the entire presentation after we have completed the session. Soon thereafter, we are also recording the session. We will not be recording the question and answer session, so that we will also share the recording so that you can use it as a reference tool for the future. So why the big hype about public procurement? Why do we need public procurement legislation and so on? There was a study done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, shortened OECD, and in their foreign bribery report in 2014, one of the things that they confirm is that public procurement is one of the government's activities most vulnerable to corruption. It's just due to the volume of the transactions and the financial interests at stake. And I think we can all kind of align to this particular statement. So corruption is not something that is only faced in Trinidad and Tobago, but worldwide. And what they suggested is that they discovered that 2/3 of foreign bribery cases occurred in sectors closely associated with contracts or licensing through public procurement. And if we take some figures in Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of our budget, we look and say that the budget is about $52 billion a year. Let's assume that 26 billion of that is spent on public procurement activities. And we are able to save, let's say, 20%, because they suggested that between 10 and 30% of the investment could be saved and is lost just because of mismanagement and corruption. And we are able to save 20% of that. That is $5.2 billion per year potentially in savings. And you know, I did this presentation to a couple of public sector persons, and they say, well, Mr. Lalchan, you know, that's probably just scratching the surface. We can save a lot more than that if you really eliminate the mismanagement and corruption. So you're looking at about 5.2 billion, which means that every 5 years you could run the country for free in terms of public procurement, if these figures hold true. There was another study that was done by the European Commission, and they estimate that euro $120 billion are lost each year, and they estimate between 20 and 25% is lost because of the same issues of corruption and bad practices. So if you think that we are bad, just imagine in the European Commission, which you know, in the Corruption Perception Index, they rank very high. And they also recognize that they lose a significant amount of monies because of the lack of management and corruption. And you will see in red, they are highlighted because of the lack of adequate capability, which we're going to come back to in our presentation, and management of the procurement function. And they estimate about, you see that on the pie chart, the bottom section there where the cursor is, about 48% is lost just because of poor management. So if you get management correct, of the public procurement function, we can save a significant amount of money. So that just gives you a context in which we can now go into the discussion. So what is procurement and what is public procurement? Procurement, according to the SIPS 2019 definition, procurement is a strategic function of a business which involves a high level of skill. So it is not just buying stuff on a three-code system. It is a strategic function, and we'll get back to that during the presentation and how we develop our strategic initiatives and so on. Procurement also refers to the process of acquiring goods, works, and services, and you'll see that regularly referenced in the Act. The process is a huge process, and it spans the whole cycle, from the identification of your needs, the choosing of adequate procurement methods, sourcing suppliers and evaluation of their offers, up to the award of contract and management of those contracts. An integral part of the procurement process is the management of the contracts and the assets through the whole project lifecycle. And this has been identified by the UNDP. Procurement or public procurement means the acquisition of goods, works, or services involving the use of public money, and this is according to our Act under Section 4 of the present Act. Now, purchasing. Purchasing is really a subset of procurement, and it is the act of physically ordering and buying something. And this is according to SIPS 2019 brochure. Purchasing is a subset of the broader procurement process, as I mentioned, and it is restricted to the functions associated with buying goods and services, and includes activities such as ordering, expediting, receiving goods, and fulfilling payments. So it's really part of the overall procurement function. So now, if you just do a quick comparison between what is procurement versus purchasing, procurement is broad in its focus. It is normally proactive, includes a lot of planning and strategizing, and it's really long-term in its nature. So that's why we refer to it as strategic. Whereas purchasing is short-term, it's a narrow focus subset of procurement. It is reactive in nature most of the times, and it satisfies our short-term goals. So it is part of your long-term strategy. So let's go into the Act. Act number 1 of 2015 as amended, it is to provide for the public procurement and the retention and disposal of public property. Many a times we refer to the Procurement Act and only look at procurement activities, but it really covers retention and disposal of public property, and we'll delve into that as we go through the presentation. And it's in accordance with the principles of good governance, namely accountability, transparency, integrity, and value for money. I'll touch on one of these in the next slide. The establishment of the Office of Procurement Regulations led and will lead to the repeal of the Central Tenders Board Act, Chapter 7191, and related matters. Now that's important because wherein before a number of the ministries would have depended on the Central Tenders Board to fulfill their requirements as it relates to procurement, and to some extent disposal of items through the Board of Survey, this will now go away, and all ministries and by definition all public bodies will have to stand on their own 2 feet to fulfill the requirements of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. So that's very important. So who is the OPR? The Office of Procurement Regulation. It was established by the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015. And as I mentioned, the amendments. Now we are a regulatory body governed by an independent board, and this board has been appointed by the President of the Republic in consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. And the first board was appointed on January 12th. So we just about coming to about 4 years in operation. And we comprise of 10 members, 11 including the Procurement Regulator and Chairman of the Board, and that is contained in Section 10 of the Act. Now, our independence is made very clear in Section 13(2)(b) of the Act, and it states that the OPR shall not be subject to the direction or control of any other person or authority in the performance of its function, but shall be accountable to Parliament. In fact, next week, Wednesday, we will be appearing before the Public Accounts Committee to give an account of our stewardship. And normally our report goes to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate with a copy to the corporation's role for information. So that said, who really falls under the new Act? Who is a public body? And this includes the Office of the President, and that's the President of the Republic, so they fall under the Act. The Parliament, even though we report into Parliament, they also fall under the Act. The judiciary and all the various arms of the judiciary, whether it's the magistracy, the tax appeal board, high courts, and so on, all fall under the Act. A ministry or a department or a division of a ministry, the Tobago House of Assembly or a division of the Tobago House of Assembly, a municipal corporation established under the Municipal Corporation Act, a regional health authority established under the Regional Health Authorities Act, a statutory body, responsibility for which is assigned to a minister of government, state-controlled enterprise, service commission established under the Constitution or other written law, and more than important is this last one, a body corporate or unincorporated entity using public money. So if you are not caught in the aforementioned list of public bodies, you are caught under the last one where you use public money. And what is public money? Public money is money that is received or receivable by a public body, raised by an instrument from which it can be reasonably inferred that the state accepts ultimate liability in the case of default, for example, or the issuing of bonds and so on to raise funds, spent or committed for future expenditure by a public body, distributed by a public body to a person, raised in accordance with a written law for a public purpose, or appropriated by Parliament. So you can see it is wide and very wide, especially Section D. If, for example, you as a public body, THA, distribute funds to a person, whether that person is a person in law or individual, like an NGO, that person falls to the definition of a public body and must give account for how they spend the money that has been distributed to them. So what are the objects of the Act? What are we trying to achieve? And we would have mentioned accountability, integrity, transparency, and value for money. But the objects actually goes further to promote the principles of efficiency, as to avoid wastage, fairness in our dealings with suppliers and contractors, equity, very important, public confidence in how we discharge our responsibilities, local industry development, and that's one is very close to our hearts. We want to make sure that the local industry, whether it's local to Tobago, local to Trinidad, local to the regional corporations, that the development is one of the areas that we focus on in terms of the award of contracts for supply of goods, works, and services. Sustainable procurement and sustainable development. And you know, recently they had this big session in Glasgow, I believe it was. And a lot of discussion took place about sustainable development. And we have recently had a detailed discussion with 3 companies in Trinidad, Heritage, NGC, and Water and Sewage Authority, to look at sustainable development. So what is integrity? I did mention that I wanted to touch on this particular aspect of it. Integrity relates or refers to the use of funds, resources, assets, and authority according to the intended official purposes and in a manner that is well informed, aligned with the public interest, and aligned with broader principles of good governance. And this is very important. We expect a high level of integrity in the operations of our public bodies in how they discharge their responsibilities. It means simply avoiding corruption and conflicts of interest. And that's in its simplest terms. How do we go about achieving integrity in public procurement? Now, the behavior of management and procurement officials should be consistent with the public purpose of the organization. So what's the public purpose of the individual public body? And in order to make sure that you are consistent with that, you must really appreciate what is the purpose of the organization. To implement measures to limit the scope of undue influence and avoid conflict of interest. And we can do that by having proper code of ethics set up. We have developed code of ethics to deal with public bodies and contractors and suppliers. And we can set up integrity packs. How do we go about protecting whistleblowers in terms of confidentiality and so on, so they feel comfortable in reporting bad practices, confidentiality, and impartiality agreements. Additionally, when dealing with public procurement, we expect proper record of the communication between the contracting entity, the suppliers, and contractors. Best practice is written, because it's easy to say, well, he said, she said, they said, and so on. That's not good practice, because when it comes to verifying what actually was said, the best practice is written communication. And the records must be kept intact for a certain period of time. And additionally, we should limit negotiation or amendments to final tenders and proposal only after submission and not during the solicitation phase of the procurement activity. We do recognize that individual public bodies have their code of conduct, but we have developed an overarching one, and we encourage the adoption of good practices in the procurement by establishing minimum standards of ethical behavior. And if you look at the code of conduct that we developed, and it's on our website, you will see a very good detailed aspect of how you deal with things like interfaces with public bodies and the suppliers and contractors, and the code of conduct, whether or not if there is a breach, what you deal with it, what constitute things like conflict of interest and so on. So it's a good document to refer to as you move forward. Now the Act under Section 13 prescribes certain things that the office has to put in place. These are our functions. This is why we were set up. And one of the things, the first one is to establish a comprehensive database of information on public procurement and tenders received and award and values of contracts. So going forward, 3 weeks after the end of each quarter, so for example, the end of December just gone, by 3 weeks after, which is 21st of January, once the Act is fully proclaimed, all public bodies have to publish to the office all contracts awarded, to whom it was awarded, and the value of those awards. Additionally, any variation orders or any issues of litigation. You have to publish that, and that is then rolled up into one report that goes into Parliament through the Speaker of the House. We are, secondly, to set training standards, competency levels, and certification requirements to promote best practice in procurement. Now, what we have found out since we took up the office is that there is a huge deficiency of competencies. So we have already written the standards, and we have had a rollout of those standards to all named procurement officers, accounting officers, and also the Institute of Higher Learning Education. So they are well aware of what is required, and at different levels, we have different competencies set. For example, buyers at the lower level of the scale, right up to the manager in charge of the unit. What you require to gain the competencies in. So that is already set up. Additionally, we have recently signed a contract to set up a learning management system where any member practitioner could come into our system and be self-taught. And we are also working with the Accreditation Council, the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago, to set these competencies levels in conjunction with the Higher Institute of Learning in Trinidad and Tobago. And we did have members from Tobago join us in those sessions, so they are aware of what is required. Now, we are also supposed to issue and review guidelines in relation to public procurement and the retention and disposal of public property. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through that. Samantha will go through that for us. We have so far issued 41 guidelines so that you can adopt our guidelines as written for your individual practices. And we have also included in those 41 guidelines update model handbooks incorporating standardized bidding documents, procedural forms, and relevant documents. The reason for that is that as many as we have public bodies right now, we have different practices and procedural forms that are being used. So we have standardized all those in our documentation. Now, if you choose to not accept the OPR's handbooks and guidelines that we have set up, you can use it as a model, develop your own handbooks and guidelines, because you may have certain unique needs, and they must be brought to the office and be approved before you use them. And these will be referred to as special guidelines and handbooks. The ones that I referred to above are general. These are special, and you can develop your own one, or you can use the ones that have been prepared by the office, amend them. Just tell us which areas that you want to amend to satisfy your own local needs, and we will so approve, and then it becomes your operating manual. So you have three choices: use as presented, develop your own in conjunction with ours, or amend the existing ones and have it approved by the office. To promote the use of technology in public procurement and the retention and disposal of public property, and this is something that we will be encouraging to go into electronic procurement, reverse auctions, and so on. A number of organizations have already started that process. We are hoping one day to have one platform where everybody could benefit from, but we are not there yet. It's a work in progress. To provide best practice, and again, if we see there are certain best practices in the THA, and we want to share that with other public bodies, we will be doing that in terms of whether or not you have good practices in electronic transactions or any other good practices. We'll be happy to share those also. And to harmonize policy systems and practices in relation to public procurement activities and the disposal of public properties. You know, when we started, we looked at, for example, the regional corporations, and as many as you have the 14 regional corporations in Trinidad, you have 14 different sets of practices. Now think about the possibility of pulling together those 14 and getting one set standard in place and the type of synergies you could benefit from. Review procurement practices and delivery system on an annual basis. This is about continuous best practice performance, and we will be doing that not only on an annual basis, but as often as we believe it's necessary to improve best practice. To develop and maintain system-wide databases and technology, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. To promote the awareness of public bodies and the public, this is like what we are doing right now, and we have had sessions with, for example, Manufacturers Association, Chambers of Commerce, the JCCs, the Law Association, Institute of Chartered Accountants, Institute of Internal Auditors, Corporate Governance Institute, Project Management Institute. So as many persons who would have invited us, we would have had those sessions, and we continue so to do. We have had several sessions in person in Tobago also, and we will continue to do that once the time and the systems allow us to do that. But so far, it has been working well with the online system. To undertake research and surveys and so on, we continue to do that and liaise with a number of international organizations like the IADB, the European Commission, University of Nottingham, and so on in terms of best practice. This one is, you will see it in red. And when we took up office, we thought that this would have been a conflict for the office to act for in the name and on behalf of the state to dispose of real property owned by the government in such manner as the government may consider appropriate and desirable. So we believe that if we are to investigate the disposal of real property, we should not be getting involved in this actual disposal of those property because it kind of ties our hands. So we ask the government to remove that responsibility from us, put it in another organization, but we will have the responsibility for audit how that goes. So that was amended in the 2020 amendment in December and taken out from under our purview. To create and publish standard form contracts for public procurement and disposal of public property. We are hoping that the standard form contracts will be used by all public bodies and you can tweak it to satisfy your unique needs, but the general terms and conditions will be standard across all organizations. Again, that will save on things like legal costs. If we have a standardized approach to it, you don't have to engage legal services to do every time you have a procurement activity or a disposal activity. Now, this one is particularly important to prepare and maintain a database of pre-qualified contractors and suppliers. We have already established that database. A number of contractors and suppliers have already come in and registered. And once the act is fully proclaimed, contractors and suppliers will have 6 months in which to get on that database and be fully pre-qualified in order to do business with any public body. So there will be one list of pre-qualified contractors that you select from. So, and how we have developed it is developed it by region. So all regional corporation, you have to state that you are in regional corporation, for example, Tunapuna Regional Corporation or a city corporation. So it's set up that you can register by regional corporation. The Tobago House of Assembly has a separate area. The CARICOM region has a separate area, and international have a separate area. So if you're looking for pre-qualified contractors within the Tobago region, you can easily go in and select the contractors that have been pre-qualified, and you can do your pre-selection based on the list of contractors in the Tobago space. Similar with the regional corporations and so on. But you must state that you have reserved these contracts for practitioners within the Tobago area and so on. So that's an area that you can pre-qualify by these regions and also pre-select based on the number of contractors you have. Now, if you only have one contractor pre-qualify a particular service in the Tobago area, you may want to expand it to encourage other contractors to come into the database and get pre-qualified, or expand it into other contractors from in the Trinidad sector. To prepare and maintain a list of pre-qualified mediators, arbitrators, and experts for the purposes of alternate dispute resolution. So when we do have disputes coming before the office, and by way of contracts that you have disputes that could be settled through mediation or arbitration, we will have a list of mediators, arbitrators, and experts for ADR, so that you can go straight onto the database and select from the database. To provide advice on best practice on the aggregation of the procurement of or disposal of goods for the purpose of obtaining value for money. Let me just link this back to one at the top. Now, going forward, when you get pre-qualified as a contractor, you will have to state a couple of things. One, what line of business that you are involved in. Line of business, for example, light construction, heavy construction, road building. And that line of business goes right through the whole system, so that anytime you do a business, and even when you are reporting on a quarterly basis, you'll have to report based on line of business. So it allows a supplier contractor to pre-qualify by a line of business. The same line of business that we are using, the UNSPSC code, is going to be approved by the procuring entity. So they approve the line of business by the contractor. And for example, if across all ministries we see there is a common line of business that people are procuring, for example, stationery, we can then aggregate those stationery requests and get some synergies and develop a way to bulk purchase and therefore get best prices, so therefore obtaining value for money. So there's a reason why we have chosen line of business as the means of pre-qualifying. And then the last two, we can audit and review the system of procurement and disposal of public property to ensure that there is compliance with the objects of the Act, which I would have covered previously. We also have the powers to investigate on our own initiative or upon complaint from any party involved in public procurement and disposal of public property, or any member of the public, any alleged or suspected breach of this Act. So we do have a team already trained and on board to do both audit and investigation once the Act is fully proclaimed. In fact, we have gotten so far 18 areas of whistleblowing that we were not able to investigate. However, we would have passed those on to the relevant state agencies that is responsible for those areas with a brief as to how we request that they deal with it. One of the things that we have, and when we roll out these sessions, is that we discourage persons at board levels to get involved in procurement activities. So the THA secretaries, they should not play a role, a direct role in the procurement, evaluation, or award process within the public body. The accounting officer is the one to inform the secretaries of decisions regarding procurement proceedings. Now that said, this is how we expect it to work. And I'm going to come to it in a future slide, but 6 weeks after the reading of the national budget, in the case of the THA also, you will have your budget presentation and so on. You are supposed to publish on your website all your procurement activities that you'll be involved in. So we would expect at the highest level of the THA and at the secretaries level and the chief secretaries level that these procurement activities is approved in advance of the publication of those statements. So the secretaries and the THA is fully aware of all the procurement activities. Not only are you aware of it, but you will be aware of the method by which you will be procuring, the contractors who would be most likely invited to bid. For example, if you have open bidding, you wouldn't be able to identify, but where you have selective, you'll have to get that list of contractors already approved at that level, so that when the accounting officer does indicate that these were the approvals and these were the contracts that we are about to award, that will be not any secret. It would have already been published. And all public bodies are required now under the Act to publish within 6 weeks all their procurement activities for the next year. What that does is that they give all your contractors an opportunity to be engaged and to take advantage when those opportunities arise. They are notified way in advance. So it's not now, well, we have a contract to give out and it's today for tomorrow. So and then you say, well, we want the bid in 2 days time or 2 weeks time. There will be stipulated periods under which you have to operate based on regulations. However, in the cases of emergencies, there will be provision as to how you deal with emergencies. In terms of emergencies are the ones that you would not have put in the plan, but it will crop up because the nature of your business will require emergency type purchases that will be guided by an emergency procurement process. So I'm sure we're going to have some questions in this part of it. When we get to the question and answer, we'll take that then. So the roles and responsibilities of accounting officers are equivalent. The financial regulations of the Exchequer and Audit Act sets out these accountabilities, and it says that under Section 4, the accounting officer shall be responsible for ensuring that the financial business of the state for which he is responsible is properly conducted, and that the public funds are entrusted to his care properly safeguarded and applied only to the purpose intended by Parliament. All accounting officers are personally and pecuniarily responsible for the due performance of the financial duties of the departments, the proper collection and custody of all public monies received by them or receivable by them, and for any accounts rendered by them or under their authority. Now, there are a couple other areas of responsibilities which I would not go through, but just to say that if the accounting officer delegates that responsibility, sub-delegates down the line, they are ultimately responsible for the persons that they would have redelegated to. And they need to make sure that the proper governance structures are in place to ensure that what is required is done in accordance with the Exchequer and Audit Act. So who is responsible for procurement? And this is a direct quote, and it's very important to understand who is responsible for procurement within a public body as defined before. Section 61(2) says, for the purpose of the Act, a public body shall have a procurement officer who shall be responsible for public procurement and the disposal of public property for that body. And when we all know, the legal minds would tell you that shall means mandatory, and shall notify the office in writing of the name and designation of its procurement officers. We have most of the named procurement officers already on our records. 61(3) says, a reference in the Act to the commission of an offense by a public body shall be construed as a reference to the commission of the offense by the procurement officer referred to in subsection 2, or any officer who purports to act in such a capacity. So if you take on the responsibility to usurp the responsibility of the named procurement officer, and you decide that you want to organize and do your procurement in a different way, the person who puts themselves in that position will be held liable under the Act if the offense was committed with his direct consent or connivance, or he or she with knowledge did not exercise reasonable diligence to prevent the commission of the offense. And you will see some of the offenses and the charges are very significant in terms of the breach of the Act. What we have also included in the regulations is the establishment of what we call a PDAC, or Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee. And it is contained in Part 9 of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Methods and Procedures. Under Section 21(1), it says a procuring entity shall establish a Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee, and the committee shall comprise of the corporate secretary or head of legal, and you will see this is the persons that are the head of the organization, head of finance, a subject matter expert, or such other members as may be necessary. So before you used to have all these board subcommittees of doing board procurement and so on. This is an advisory committee that advises the accounting officer of issues before the committee and recommend for approval. A member of the committee may be sourced from another public body if you don't have sufficient capacity within the public body. A senior officer shall be appointed as the secretary to attend all meetings of the committee, but shall not be a member of the committee for voting rights. The committee shall review reports, recommendations for contract award, and procurement proceedings and property disposal files to determine adherence to the Act and the regulations, adherence to the handbooks and guidelines, adherence to the approved procedure for procurement and disposal strategy, and achievements of the objects of the Act. Where the committee is of the opinion that there is not adherence or achievements as set out in sub-regulations 5 above, it shall recommend the appropriate action to the procurement officer with a written explanation providing reasons for its decision. And the committee shall cause the written explanation to be forwarded to the accounting officer for noting. Where there is an agreement, the committee shall give the accounting officer a written recommendation which must be accompanied by the procurement proceedings filed and the property disposal file. So again, it comes back to the whole issue of proper documentation, and you'll see later on why we are suggesting proper documentation. A member of the committee shall disclose his interests, and wherever we have his is also her, and not take part in the proceedings of the committee where he or she is a member, director, or shareholder of a company or other body corporate, is a proprietor or a partner in a firm or partnership, is employed by or is otherwise a party to a contract for services, has a financial interest in or relationship with someone involved in the process, is a relative of an individual being reviewed by the committee. This is very important because this will constitute a conflict of interest, and failure to disclose conflict of interest could lead to significant jail term and fine. You may not be able to see this, but this is just a diagrammatical reference to what we would just looked at. But if you're looking at it at a big screen, you'll probably see it. On the left-hand side, you'll see the disposal committee, which is enshrined in the Act. You are required to have a disposal committee to deal with disposal of surplus materials and so on. You also have an evaluation committee that does the evaluation of tenders for award purposes. Those recommendations comes to the named procurement officer, and then the named procurement officer sends a recommendation to the PDAC. The PDAC then advises the accounting officer whether to accept on the disposal side or reject, and also on the procurement side to accept or reject. And in this case, we are suggesting, if you look at the dotted line going back, you reported back some of the areas to the board of directors who would be interested in some of these high profile procurement and disposal activities. And what we are suggesting in the THA's case, you bring it to the attention of the secretaries or the chief secretary or assistant chief secretary, where there is a high profile procurement or disposal. So they should not be blindsided, and the accounting officer or named procurement officer should not adopt the approach that under the Act they are responsible. With responsibility comes accountability. And we don't want the head of the organizations to be blindsided. So at all times, the THA's chiefs and other secretaries could indicate which one of these procurement activities should come back to them so that they will be aware of what is taking place. So that all that is part of the process that we have put in place for the governance of public procurement and disposal. So under section 6.1, any procurement of goods, works, or services and retention and disposal of public property that is not done in accordance with the Act, and any procurement contract or agreement that is not entered into in accordance with the Act shall be void and illegal. So that could be, if we recognize that information comes to us that things are not done in accordance with the Act, we can make a call and make it void and illegal to continue with that particular contract. Of course, in the exercise of our function, we shall act expeditiously and take necessary steps to minimize any negative economic impact and so on. I would have mentioned the first item here, not later than 6 weeks after the approval of the national budget published on the website and so on, all your procurement activities that is planned for the following 12 months. You are to update the information as and when necessary if you have significant changes. And if any member of the public requests a copy, you are bound by law to give them a copy of it and charge them a fee for the reproduction of it. This is contained in section 27(1) of the Act. If you fail to provide that information to the person requesting it, they can come to the office and the office will intervene to allow them to get a copy of those procurement activities that you are supposed to publish. Now, I would have mentioned the depository in terms of the pre-qualification and so on. Any member of the public, whether you are sole practitioner, registered company, partnership, operating, and you want to register as a supplier contractor, you can come into the depository and register. So for example, if you have contractors within the Tobago environment and they say, well, they have been pre-qualified with the THA. All they need to do is to go into our database, put in all their information, and through a workflow process that will be sent to the THA procurement officer. And the procurement officer will look at it. Everything is in order. They have the authority, not the OPR. The OPR wouldn't get involved in it. So the THA is still responsible for pre-qualifying the suppliers and contractors and for ensuring that the information is accurate and so on. The depository, of course, will be accessible to the public for viewing. And the supplier contractor is responsible for the accuracy of the information they put on the depository. And of course, when you do your due diligence under Section 29(1), you may require a supplier contractor who has submitted the information before to reconfirm the accuracy of the information during, for example, an active tender. So you are in your right to ask them to reconfirm the accuracy of that information. I would not go into these definitions, but it's there for your own information. It deals with pre-qualification. I would have mentioned the pre-qualification before. I would have mentioned pre-selection before, but these are just definitions under Section 4. Now, this is important when you are looking at the pre-qualification application of the suppliers and contractors. Under Section 29(1), they must have the legal capacity to enter into the procurement contract. So you would not pre-qualify somebody under the age of 18 because they don't have that legal capacity. If they're going for a certain type of contracts, you want to make sure that they are adequately funded and so on. So therefore, they are not insolvent, in receivership, bankrupt, or being wound up. Their affairs are not being administered by a court or a judicial officer. Their business activities have not been suspended, and they are not the subject of legal proceedings for any of the foregoing. Now, you will see an item here in red. This was the previous act. Have not, and the directors or officers have not been convicted of any criminal offense. We have now changed that because what that did was to exclude anybody who would have been convicted of any criminal offense. It doesn't matter how small or how large it was. And we thought that if you're looking at restorative justice, we went to the government and said, we believe that that should be changed. And what they have done now is to change it to read something like fraud or fraud-related activities that you were convicted both in Trinidad or outside of Trinidad for a period of 10 years. So after 10 years, you could come back into the system. It goes on to say that you must have fulfill your obligation to pay all required taxes and contributions in Trinidad. Of course, if you are benefiting from state funding, you should pay your required taxes and contributions. And you must have the necessary professional and technical qualification and competencies, financial resources, equipment, and other physical facilities, managerial capabilities. So all these are things you will check to make sure they have it. So you wouldn't give electrical work to a plumber if they are not qualified as a plumber. And they must meet the relevant industry standards. For example, in some of the live plants operating, and I think you may have one or two in Tobago, where you require certain type of industry standard, for example, store certification within a live plant environment, you will want to make sure that they have those certifications. And of course, you must treat, the last point there, must treat everybody equally who will be pre-qualified, and you should not selectively give jobs to particular suppliers and contractors based on friends or family relationships and so on. Now, there is now required under the Act to establish what we refer to as standstill period. Now, when you are issuing requests for a proposal, you are required to state whether or not there is a standstill period. And that is a period from the dispatch of the notice as required under Section 35(2), during which a procuring entity cannot accept the successful bids and the supplier contractor can challenge the decision so notified. So I'll go through this in the simple layman terms. You send out your request for proposal, you state there will be a standstill period of, let's say, 10 or 12 days. You only have a period between 10 and 15 days. So let's assume that you say 10 days is your standstill period. You go through the entire process. You do your evaluation, you agree that you have a preferred contractor A to award the contract to. You had 5 persons bidding for the contract. You are now required to notify all 5 and state that we have come to the end of the process and we will be awarding the contract to contractor A at price B, and allow the next 4 contractors to ask, if they so desire, for a review as to why they would not be successful. And you have this 10-day period to give the reasons to them. You are now obligated to give reasons why they would not be successful. Once you have gone past that and there are no further concerns, you will then go ahead and award the contract. And once the contract is awarded, there can be no challenge. So that's how the standstill period in layman terms work. And if you require further discussion, we can do that at the end. The standstill period is not required for emergency type purchases, just to make sure that that is understood. Now, disposal of public property includes the transfer with it without value, sale, lease, concession, or other alienation of property that is owned by a public body. And public property means real or personal property owned by a public body. And what we have done is that we have set up some handbooks and guidelines that will give you the guidelines as to how you go about disposing of public property. Now, you are now required to dispose of your public property that is owned and operated under your control. Previously, there was a requirement where some public body had to go through the Central Tenders Board, and sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4 years to get these things done. You have that within your purview now to dispose of public property under your purview in accordance with the guidelines that you will get approved by the Office of Procurement Regulations, or if you have your own system that you want to establish for our approval. So that's in the simplest form how it will work. Now, if a contractor or supplier decide that they want to bring a challenge based on something that they would have observed in the public procurement or disposal activities, the supplier contractor may bring challenge proceedings where it is alleged, not proven, where it is alleged that a procuring entity made a decision or took an action that is not in compliance with the act, and the supplier contractor has suffered or is likely to suffer loss. Now, once that is done, within 3 days of receiving that request, we publish it in the daily newspaper, 2 daily newspapers. You must submit it in writing, and the application for review of the terms of solicitation, pre-qualification, or pre-selection, or a decision or action taken by the procuring entity in pre-qualification or pre-selection proceedings prior to the deadline for presenting submission. So in other words, you can challenge the terms of the solicitation, whether or not somebody should have been pre-qualified or pre-selected. You can challenge all that before the presentation of the submission of the bids. If it is in the procurement proceedings, it has to be done within the standstill period, which I would have mentioned. You must do it within the 10-day period. If you have no standstill period, it's 7 working days after the publication of the notice of decision action in accordance with the Act. So these are the only condition under which you can challenge the award or the potential award or solicitation, pre-selection, and pre-qualification. These are the only things that is required under the Act. So it's not open-ended. So 3 months after the award of a contract, you cannot come and say, well, you cause a challenge, and this will just disrupt the operation. You must do it within these time frame. If there is something that happens 3 months after, that will fall under an investigation, not a challenge procedure. So after the 3 days of the receipt of the application, we can order the suspension of the procurement proceedings at any time before the entry into the force of the procurement contract, or order the suspension of the performance of the procurement contract or the operation of a framework agreement, if and for as long as we find it necessary, that such suspension is necessary to protect the interests of the applicant. So there are powers under the Act that we can suspend the operations until such time that we think that it will not prejudice the person making the application. So once you are a member on the database, you're working good, everything is going fine, you have no reason to concern with being made ineligibility or what you normally refer to as blacklisting. But if as a supplier and a contractor, you misbehave and you don't perform well on a consistent basis and you're seen in red, we will go through a process of making you ineligibility and you'll be taken off the approved list of contractors and suppliers. And this will be published to all public bodies. So we will add a supplier contractors to this list where the supplier contractor consistently failed to provide satisfactory performance, and we'll be expecting, for example, the THA to come and say, well, contractor A has not been performing satisfactory. Here's the evidence. Could you remove them? We call them in, ask them to respond to the allegation. If we are not satisfied, they are taken off the list. If we are satisfied, we then look back in with the THA and say, well, this is the reasons, etc., and have a discussion. So it's not an automatic based on recommendation. There will be a hearing procedure. If you are found as a supplier contractor to be indulging in corrupt or fraudulent practices or is convicted of an offense under the Act, under A, you can be placed on the ineligibility list for a period of up to 10 years. Under B and C, you will be placed on the ineligibility list for a period of 10 years. So you'll not be able to deal with the public bodies for 10 years. And in that case, all the officers and directors in that particular company that has been found guilty and so on will also be placed on the ineligibility list and published, so they will not be able to come and form a new company if they are found guilty. So they will also be taken off from the system for a period of 10 years, or up to 10 years as it is. And this is the definition of what a supplier contractor is. Any person who is a director, manager, senior officer, partner, or a similar officer, or any person who bought stock in such a capacity, and then it defines senior officer who kind of covers everybody in the company of an influential position. Now, what are some of the specific impacts of the Act on public bodies? Now, I mentioned all these already, but just to recap: removal of the Central Tenders Board, the provision for a named procurement officer, the establishment of the disposal committee, establishment of the PDAC, the development of the annual procurement plans, the approval of the handbooks and guidelines, and the implementation of internal control frameworks for public procurement. We do have a handbook and guideline that deals with internal control frameworks that you could reference from our library. So, I mentioned that breach of the Act will lead to certain consequences. So here are some of those consequences. If you fail to comply with the direction of the OPR issued under the Act, you can be charged just $100,000, no jail term there. If a member of the board of the OPR or a committee of the OPR failed to disclose an interest during an investigation or a hearing, knowingly or willfully, we can be charged $500,000 and 1 year in prison. If you are found guilty of splitting of procurement contracts, $500,000 and 1 year in prison. Failure of the procuring entity to comply with requirements with respect to confidentiality of information. You must keep information confidential during active tender and so on. $500,000 1 year in prison. If somebody reports some wrongdoing in the THA and somebody decides to victimize them, $500,000 1 year in prison. Failure of a person to report instances of collusion. So if you are aware of collusion taking place and you fail to report it, and that is proven after the fact that you were aware of it as a public body or a public person, $500,000 1 year in prison. If you make a false report to the office and it's proven, $500,000 1 year. If you conceal or destroy information required for an investigation. Now you would have seen me or heard me in the past in the presentation mention the need for written, the need for written, the need for written. If during an investigation you fail to, or you conceal or destroy information required for an investigation, you can be charged $5 million and 10 years in prison. So it's very absolutely necessary to keep your information for investigation. You have to keep it for a period of 7 years. However, if there's an active investigation, you'll be required to keep it for past the 7 years if told to do so. Failure to comply with the requirement with respect to confidentiality during a challenge proceedings that I mentioned, $500,000 in 1 year. Any conduct influencing public officers, including bribery, conflict of interest, you would have heard me mention that on several occasions, corrupt, fraudulent, collusive, cohesive, or obstructive practices, $1 million and 5 years in prison. If you're involved in bid rigging, that is influencing the procurement proceedings or trying to influence it by rigging the bid rigging, $5 million and 10 years in prison. Altering a procurement document to influence the outcome of the procurement proceedings, $2 million and 7 years. And if you contravene one of the regulations made by the minister on the recommendation of the OPR, you can be charged up to $1 million and 5 years. Now the graphic underneath gives you a good idea of what could really happen and lead to some real tearful situation behind bars. All right, so that was my session in terms of the procurement and so on that would have gone over the last 4 years. Now, there were some amendments to the Act, and I'll go through these pretty quickly because I believe you would have shared the Act and the amendments. So the Procurement and Disposal Amendment Act 2016 sets up the Procurement Review Board. Before, if you had a decision by the office under the challenge proceeding, there was no review provision. Now that board has been established and the members have been appointed. 2017 amendment provide for the term of office of the regulator and other members. Previously, it was 7 years for the regulator, now it's 5 years. Some members were 5 and 4 years. That has been changed now to 4 and 3 years, so that it reduced the amount of years you can serve. And then the last one was in 2020, very recently, had a lot of public debate actually. There were 7 amendments. One of the amendments was the definition of bid rigging. When we met with the Director of Public Prosecution, we had some discussion with him, and we didn't think that bid rigging as defined originally constitute a criminal offense, and we had to get legal advice on that. And so that has been changed now to define bid rigging as a criminal offense. Section 7 has been amended, but I'll touch on that shortly. Disposal of public property, I mentioned that Section 13(1)(o) is now removed. Due diligence in terms of criminal offense, I mentioned that under Section 29. In terms of how long, 10 years. The time of the decision of the review of an action by an entity, previously it was 20 days in which to give that decision. Now it's changed to 30 days. Conduct influencing public officers, the definition under 6th schedule was changed, and the option available to public officers under the 7th has been amended also. Under bid rigging, it's now reading collusive, price fixing, and anti-competitive behavior, which is designed to unfairly influence the outcome of a competitive tender process in favor of one or more bidders. So that's how it's changed now in terms of bid rigging. Now under Section 7, you'll see a section in red here. So previously, it would have captured the treaty or other form of agreement between the Trinidad and Tobago government and a state or entity within a state, an agreement entered into with an international financial institution like the IADB and so on, an agreement for technical and other cooperation. Now, what has been deleted is the part in red. So it stops where it says the requirements of the treaty or agreement shall prevail. Previously, it would have allowed except that the procurement of goods, works, or services shall be governed by this act and shall promote the socio-economic policies of Trinidad and Tobago. So in other words, what has been taken off now is that the treaty or agreement will supersede the act in its simplest form. That's what it is. However, you still required, even though under A, you have the treaty, you still required to present to the office a report in terms of you are still in compliance with section 29, which we would have gone through in some detail. So even though it's taken out, you are still required to report to the office that you are in compliance with section 29. So a lot of persons have interpreted to say that it's a free-for-all and there is no reporting requirement. That's not so. Section 7.3, I just would have mentioned that you must be in compliance with section 29. The Act now has excluded from under the purview of the office legal services, debt financing services for the national budget, accounting and auditing services, medical emergency or other scheduled medical services. So it's not everything in medical. For example, the goods under medical is still under the Act, but only services and things like emergencies and so on. And one would imagine that you don't go through a procurement activities for emergency medical services and any other such services that the minister may by order. However, the minister now has to submit to the office annual guidelines which outlines the circumstances under which these exempt services may be procured. So again, it's not a full exclusion, but you will have to operate within certain guidelines. And these guidelines have to be prepared by the Minister of Finance and submitted to Parliament. I won't go through this one. I would have gone through in some detail this 13.10. And I would have also dealt with this one in terms of have not been convicted within the past 10 years of corruption or fraud-related offenses locally or internationally as an individual or director or officer of a company. That is what now would prevent you from being registered. And the decision I mentioned that is 30 days and not 20 days for us to actually put our decision in writing. This one I will go through. A relative is now defined to include a common law relationship. 59.1 says, for the purpose of subsection 1, relative means a spouse, cohabitant within the meaning of the Cohabitational Relationship Act, father, mother, brother, sister, son, or daughter. So that if those persons are actively participating in a tender and you are aware of it, you have to, and you are in a decision-making position, you have to exclude yourself and recuse yourself from participating, otherwise it will constitute a conflict of interest. All right, so that's it for me on my side. We have a couple more slides before we come to the end of the presentation. So I'll ask Sam now to take it over and go through those slides. Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lalchan, and a special good morning to all attendees. Today, I will take you through the highlights of the public procurement and disposal of public property regulations, the road to full proclamation, and a brief introduction on understanding the Procurement House of Handbooks, guidelines, procedural forms, and templates developed by the Office of Procurement Regulation. So let's delve right in. Section 63 of the Act relates to the regulation where it states that a minister may, on the recommendation of the office, make regulations to give effect to the provisions of this Act, including regulations with respect to A, the conduct of challenge proceedings under Part 5, and B, the addition to or removal from an ineligibility list under Section 58. Section 63(2) states that regulations made under this section may provide that the contravention of any regulation constitutes an offense and may prescribe penalties for any offense not exceeding a fine of $1 million and imprisonment for 5 years. And also Section 63(3) states that regulations made under this section shall be subject to affirmative resolution of Parliament. With that being said, the first time the regulations was laid in the House of Representatives was on July 2nd, 2021, and was laid again on December 13th, 2021, to be debated at a later date. The regulations shall not come into force unless and until affirmed by a resolution passed by both houses or the House of Representatives, as the case may be, as highlighted under Section 63(3) of the Act. Of note, the regulations are listed in 10 different documents, namely the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property, Participation in Procurement Regulations, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property, Pre-Qualification and Pre-Selection Regulations. We also have a Procurement Methods and Procedures Regulations. There's one for evaluation. Procurement of Consultants is another listed regulation. We also have a Record of Proceedings Regulation. There's one listed for retention of public property and disposal of personal property. Then there's one for challenge proceedings. We also have for ineligibility proceedings. And lastly, one named miscellaneous. I will now briefly highlight some of the areas covered under each of the regulations, as I previously mentioned. Under the Participation in Procurement Regulations, you will find information on domestic preference, margin of domestic preference, participation of joint ventures and other consortia, and the depository, procurement depository. Under the pre-qualification and pre-selection regulations, there's information on clarification of pre-qualification documents, invitation for pre-selection, assessments for pre-selection, and pre-selection scoring criteria. When you look at the procurement methods and procedures regulations, there will be information on strategic procurement, thresholds, open bidding, limited bidding, requests for quotations, procedures for single source selection, framework agreements, electronic reverse auction, Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee, and technical specifications. Under the evaluation regulations, you will find information on evaluation criteria, price factors, non-price factors, and the standstill period. When consulting the procurement of consultants regulations, there are areas pertaining to submission of proposals and the evaluation procedure. Now, when you look at the regulations for record of proceedings, there's information on the requirement to keep a record, content of record, and reporting. For retention of public property and disposal of personal property regulations, you will find information on the risk-based approach to retention of public property and disposal to public employees. Under the challenge proceedings regulations, you will find the procedure for review. With respect to the ineligibility proceedings regulations, there's information for hearings and evidence and ineligibility sanction. And when you peruse the miscellaneous regulations, you will find information on committee members. These regulations can be accessed via the resources tab of our website under regulations laid in Parliament. For ease of access, the link will be posted in the chat, where you can obtain further information on the areas covered under each of the regulations. As the OPR continues to work assiduously towards full proclamation and the operationalization of the Act and its regulations, we have completed 95% of our recruitment. We also rolled out the database solution to suppliers and contractors and developed approximately 41 handbooks and guidelines, most of which have been finalized and continue to be uploaded on the resources tab of our website. The link for these as well will be posted in the chat. Of note, the OPR's first stewardship report for the period 2018 to 2020 was submitted to Parliament, which can also be accessed on our website. Additionally, a response to the Public Accounts Committee was submitted on November 29, 2021, and as previously mentioned by Mr. Lalchan, the OPR will appear before the said committee on the 12th of this month. Let us now take a look at understanding the procurement house. This would include the handbooks, guidelines, procedural forms, and templates developed by the Office of Procurement Regulation. The house, which can also be found on the OPR's website, also includes some work in progress documents, which will shortly be uploaded onto the website. Now, to make the relevant documents relatable, we have placed them within various sections of the procurement house, which are the rooftop, the foundation, planning stage, tendering stage, evaluation and award stage, contract management stage, and retention and disposal stage. Looking at the roof of the procurement house, you will find the comprehensive handbook on procurement, retention, and disposal of public property, the basic procurement handbook, a practical guide, and the preparation of special handbooks and guidelines for approval by the OPR. Turning to the foundation of the procurement house, you will find the following general guidelines: framework for operational and internal control for procurement, code of conduct. You'll find sector-specific guidelines, example, health, state-controlled enterprises or non-governmental organizations, procurement of works, local government, developing procurement capacity, monitoring, managing, and reporting on procurement performance, and whistleblowing and challenge proceedings. Now we move to the 5 stages of the procurement process and look at the guidelines associated with each of these stages. Within the column of the first stage, which is the planning stage, you will find guidelines related to procurement planning, such as developing the annual procurement plan, portfolio management, category management, management of risk, procurement methods and procedures, developing specifications, sustainable procurement and sustainable development, and supply contracts. Within the column of tendering stage of the procurement house, you will find guidelines on pre-qualification and pre-selection, pre-qualification with respect to specialist consulting services, purchase requisition, request for quotation, general guidelines for invitation to bid, general guidelines for request for proposals, electronic procurement, public-private partnership, and local industry development and local content. If you require guidance on evaluation of bids and awards of contracts, the following guidelines on evaluation of bids and award of contracts, negotiation of contract, and standstill period are available within the column of the evaluation and award stage. Now, if you are dealing with contract management, the following general guidelines on management and monitoring of contract activities, the listing of contractors and suppliers, and record keeping and maintenance of procurement files may be useful, and these are available within the column of the 4th stage, which is the contract management stage. And now the last stage of the procurement process, retention and disposal of public property column, contains the handbook for retention and disposal of public property and the guideline on retention and disposal of public property. And just to reiterate, all these guidelines can be accessed via the OPR's website for your use. Now, In addition to the very detailed handbooks and guidelines, the OPR has also developed a number of procedural forms and templates to be used by public bodies in the procurement, retention, and disposal of public property functions. For procurement, you have procurement notices, market research report, procurement strategy development form, tender evaluation report, and supplier or contractor performance appraisal. For disposal, which is contained in the handbook for retention and disposal, you will find a Form A, which is request for asset disposal, Form B, inventory and inspection report, a Form C, appraisal or valuation report, Form D, disposal strategy development approval template, and Form E, summary report of approved disposal action. As applicable, there are two forms in respect of Form F, which is a transfer or donation form, and Form G, notice of rejection form. This now brings me to the end of today's presentation. Thank you for your kind attention, and we will now answer any questions you may have. Thank you.